So before saying anything about the European Revolution, let's just recognize that evolution does not take millions and billions of years. You can have very fast evolution in a single generation. For example, if everyone over 6 feet died tomorrow and height was in any way heritable, the next generation would be genetically predisposed to being shorter. Also, cutting off an extreme threshold will affect the traits for the whole breeding population, because each generation mixes the genes from the previous generation. For example, if you select against the phenotype of aggression, to the extent that there's any genetic component to that variation, which are represented by the red dots here, you will be selecting against the genotype that causes aggression. But because each generation mixes the genes up, by removing the most violent element, you are actually culling the most violent genes out of the entire gene pool in the breeding population. You're not merely lobbing off the most violent at the high end, but because the genes reshuffle each round, you will not only have fewer outright violent criminals, but you will reduce the number of violent genes, quote unquote, in the rest of the population, changing the nature of everyone in the population, not just the size of the criminal element. And this is a great segue into the European Revolution. Henry Harpending and Peter Frost wrote a paper entitled Western Europe, State Formation and Genetic Pacification, and pointed out that from 1000 AD to 1750 AD, approximately 1.5% of the male population was executed for some sort of violent crime each generation. Assuming 25-year generations, that's 30 generations. That's a removal of around 45% of the genome if we assume none of those executed for violent crimes were able to reproduce. Obviously, some almost certainly reproduced, and so the effect wouldn't be quite this big. But we would also expect the effect of reducing violent genetics to be larger from removing 1.5% per generation for 30 generations than we would from just killing the 45% most violent males in a single generation. This is because the top 1.5% most violent people represents a more concentrated cluster of violent genetics each round than the top 45% most violent people in a single round do. And during the period Harpending and Frost describe, there were massive declines in homicide in Western Europe according to an analysis by Manuel Eisner. Depending on the region they're looking at, it was about a 20 times drop in homicide from 1200 to 1800. Keep in mind these are logarithmic scales, not linear scales, in the homicide rate. We also have data on Russia, which shows that in 1880, Russia was around 5 homicides per 100,000, as opposed to 1.3 in England and 2.2 in Germany that same year. The homicide spiked in the 1980s, and then it spiked to medieval levels following the fall of the Soviet Union. The second major genetic change appears to have been the effects of a downward social regression from 1250 to 1800. During those years, according to Vegard Skrbek, the rich were having so many more surviving offspring than the poor that the children of the wealthy, in a genetic sense, replaced the poor. Using Skrbek's data, I inferred that the top 35.4% replaced the bottom 64.6% of Western Europeans around 2.3 times. Of course, in reality, it wouldn't have happened exactly like this, as there's no rule saying that certain genotypes were necessarily entirely wiped out, just that they kept getting mixed in with constant waves of downwardly mobile offspring from the upper class that amounted to a double replacement. Gregory Clark, in A Farewell to Alms, documents this process occurring in England specifically. A third selecting factor that HBD Chick likes to talk about is manoralism. And apparently in the system of manoralism, which caught on in Western Europe but not in Eastern Europe, lords tended to select for single family units, which broke up clans, and selected for people willing to marry outside the clan. And apparently lords also selected for individuals willing to put off having children until later. I don't know how true any of this is or how much of an effect any of this had, but I'm just throwing that out there as another possible third factor of genetic change. So these are three factors that appear to have paved the way to the modern economy. Now, to grossly oversimplify, this genetic change eliminated what I call the traditional economy, which is highly regimented with very limited and highly controlled markets, with licensing for all industries and fairly strict price controls. And it was the eradication of local markets and guilds and their replacement with the common market throughout the whole of England that made mass production possible and made competition serious. And the establishment of private property, as we conceive of it, also removed the lord's duties to their peasants. The peasants were kicked off the land, but yields increased. Now, you can can label the highly proscribed feudal arrangement whatever you want. I don't think it neatly falls into modern categories of private or public property, but it clearly wasn't private property as we conceive of it. And the rise of private land ownership actually produced more food with a lower number of workers who then had to go somewhere else, and so they packed the cities and factories. And we know what that led to. And this event, the rise of private land ownership in the modern sense, the elimination of individual market rules, and the formation of a uniform market law, turning all of England into a free trade zone. This is what ultimately made mechanization and what we think of when we say the Industrial Revolution possible. And this is the most important series of events in all of history. And so first off, let's do away with the myth that Europe was some backwater compared to the Arab world, India, and China. In 2010, Komen, Easterly, and Gong operationalized technological development by assigning a value to certain items deemed to be an indicator of overall technological development. This was the basket used from 1000 BC to 0 AD, and this was the basket used in 1500 AD. And here are the average scores for different populations of each era. So Europe having been backward in the past, well, that's a thing that people like to say. It's not true, but I don't know, I guess they feel like they're good people when they say it. Charles Murray, in his book Human Accomplishment, collected 183 comprehensive encyclopedias and histories of innovation in various fields and made a list of those individuals who were included in at least 50% of the qualified sources within a given field. Murray found that this measure had an extremely high degree of statistical reliability, 0.93, by showing that arbitrarily breaking the sources into two groups produced two sets of basically identical results. Murray also showed that the same results emerged when he compared sources from different parts of the world, suggesting that Eurocentrism did not significantly plague the analysis. Thus, he found that the relevant material showed a strong degree of consensus on which people and events have been historically important in science. Murray called individuals included in 50% or more of the sources significant individuals, and events mentioned in 50% or more of sources significant events. His analysis included all such individuals who lived or events which took place between the years 800 BC and 1950 AD. You'll always have shrieks of Eurocentrism, but anyone who spends any time at a university history department knows that they are obsessed with downplaying the greatness of Europeans and elevating all that is brown. Any trivial accomplishment by an Arab is ipso facto presumed to be the spark that created Europe. But what really pops out at you is that basically all invention occurred after 1500. One thing I notice is that when someone is just trying to explain matter-of-factly the history of development in a field, like geology or medicine or physics, it's always white men that they're talking about. They only start bringing up the importance of some stuff some Arab did when they're trying to battle Eurocentrism or having a unit on the importance of non-European stuff. In terms of per capita wealth, there's a similar logarithmic rise in wealth starting around 1500, according to Madison. So we have economic numbers that map onto the technological indexes. And so we see, following the genetic changes in Europe, most concentrated in the North Sea area, you had the political reforms that ultimately led to the agricultural and then the Industrial Revolution, again most concentrated in the North Sea area. So it's important to say this, virtually all invention occurred by white people after 1500. And this is not something I say out of ignorance. I'm not ignorant of China or India or Japan or algebra. And when I say that the world before 1500 was mostly stagnant with not much going on, it's not because I'm ignorant of the Roman Empire or ignorant of the Ming Dynasty or that I don't know what the Ottoman Empire was or what the Mongol Empire was. It's just that I have a little bit of perspective, and the fact is that not a whole lot happened in the Roman Empire. They fought a bunch of wars, they held a bunch of land, but otherwise very little happened in a very long period of time. Now, there's a very dangerous argument, and it's so common and so destructive, and it's that the European Revolution wasn't this measurable and proximate genetic change, but that it had something to do with Greece and Rome. Italy and Spain had just as much, if not more, access to the Greek and Roman ideas as England and the Netherlands and northern France did. In fact, they probably had more access. But these areas weren't the nexus of industrial revolution. In fact, the Arab world arguably preserved them when the Roman Empire got wiped off the map, and yet we didn't see any kind of industrial revolution in the Arab world or anything even beginning down those lines. And it is dangerous to elevate some sort of philosophy or some sort of set of ideas because you end up not jealously guarding the most important thing that has ever happened. And that is the genetic change that occurred approximately from 1000 AD to 1800 AD in Northwest Europe, radiating out from there. This is what led to the end of feudalism, the creation of the common market and of mass production, which then made mechanization economically viable, in addition to creating a population genetically predisposed to invention. It may sound like some weird religious thing to say that Europeans are the light unto the world and created life as we know it, but where's the lie? Just look at the data. This isn't some conclusion you have to stretch to see. It pops right out at you. The Industrial Revolution is why your standard of living is higher than $700 a year. Life as you know it. It's not a fluke of circumstance. It's a result of a genetic change from a specific place and time. And when you say, let's abandon and disregard those genetics that created the world as you know it, and just assume that the world will continue without their supremacy, nay, you take offense when anyone questions this idea as if it is completely self-evident that the modern world has nothing to do with the people who made it. When you do this, you threaten to do more damage than any invader, any military conqueror, any mass murderer in history has ever done, which is turn back the clock to the pre-European Revolution world. Hitler, Stalin, Mao, the Mongols, the Caliphate have nothing on you. You threaten to turn back the clock to a world before the new Europeans, when Europeans were nothing special, and so Europe was nothing special. Not that the technology would go away, but where the world becomes unfree, regimented, locked with guilds, and ultimately stagnating. And so when I was asked, what would be the benefit of white nationalism on the spot, I'm thrown for a loop. I don't even know where to begin. Do you care about anything? Do you care about free speech? Do you care about being able to start a business? Do you care about the consistent enforcement of private property? Do you care about not having people shit in the streets? Do you care about having schools that aren't prison complexes? Do you care about having nice streets, nice cops, judges that follow the law? Do you care about investment in basic scientific research? Do you care about a functional university system? Do you care about not having to constantly expend the creative energies of your people dealing with identity politics? Do you care about having lower rates of disease and not having things like Ebola and swine flu all the time? Do you care about better organ transplant compatibility? Do you care about lower rates of rape and criminality in general? Do you care about just knowing how to interact with random people because you're like them? Do you care about having companies and firms that deal with the business and deal with the facts on the ground and not with an endless racial quota game? Do you care about having to pay the equivalent of a second military budget for brown people in net government services minus what they pay in taxes? Do you want to not have all of your cities turn into Detroit, Baltimore, Haiti, and South Chicago? Do you want to not have to commute 2 hours a day? Do you care about not having to deal with constant micro-conflicts of brown people asserting dominance by playing their loud ethnic music in white spaces? Yes, ideas matter, but ideas come from people with genes who exist in interaction with other people with similar genetics in a genetic mesh. I have nothing to prove. It's those who propose otherwise that have to answer for the disaster of multiracialism that is manifest.